All right, so good evening, everyone, again. My name is Bianca Magenyi, and I'm with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, who are the organizers of today's event. And before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the island of Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people and the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's amazing to see all of you here on Zoom with us. This is really great. The chat is open. You folks can say hi, let us know where you're from, the traditional territories that you're from as well. We love to hear from people at home. Just as always, please keep your comments civil, cordial, and free from racist, sexist, or otherwise a harmful commentary. So for today's event, after our speakers give their opening remarks, we'll be opening up to questions from the audience. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box. Just look at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to find it. So that's the Q&A box, not the chat. It's easier for us to find your questions there. So the CFPI, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, is an organization that challenges unjust foreign policy measures and aims to bridge the gap between the reality and perception of Canada's role in the world. And we also work to oppose the racism that's embedded in Canadian foreign policy. And again, you can find out more about the work that we do at foreignpolicy.ca. Also want to let folks at home know that our organization is reliant on contributions from our community to keep doing this work. So please do consider donating or becoming a sustainer at foreignpolicy.ca/donate. All right, and now for tonight's event, which is a rare one, given the secretive domain of the topic at hand. Needless to say, it's tricky to organize an event that's about an issue that's where so little about it is out in the open. And so this event is about Canada's role in the greatest, or perhaps better put, the most influential intelligence alliance in human history. The NSA whistleblower, Edward Snowden, called the Five Eyes a supranational intelligence organization that doesn't answer to the known laws of its own countries. The main contributors to the contributors to this are the US National Security Agency, better known as the NSA, the Australian Signals Directorate, New Zealand's Government Communications Security Bureau, the British Government Communications Headquarters, and Canada's Communications Security Establishment, or CSE. And Canada's CSE, which in many ways is equivalent to the US's NSA, is a signals intelligence agency, I think at its heart, that has nearly 3,000 employees and a budget of $780 million. It was created after World War II, and from the north to Newfoundland to Vancouver Island, interception stations were set up in various parts of the world, as well in various parts of Canada, as well as embassies in various parts of the world. The Five Eyes was also created after World War II. And this is an organization that shares information, that is intercepted. It exchanges technologies and tactics. They cooperate on targeting and standardize their terminology, their code words, and security measures. And so CSE officers are embedded with Five Eyes counterparts, while colleagues from the US, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand also have offices in the CSE. And the government didn't admit to the existence of the CSE for nearly 4 decades. And we'll be hearing lots more about this organization tonight. Similar to the CSE, the Canadian government didn't acknowledge that it was part of the Five Eyes until 1995, which is nearly half a century after it was created. But today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau talks openly about the role, about being a part of the Five Eyes, and the media regularly reference it regarding Huawei and China. So tonight we have the great privilege of having Bill Robinson here to outline the role of the CSE. He's been following the CSE's activities tenaciously for many years, runs an important blog and Twitter account that discusses the CSE. Excuse me, I have a toddler, endless germs. Joshua Klein will be discussing the lead agency, the driving force of the Five Eyes, the NSA, or the National Security Agency. The NSA has trained CSE officials, and in the 60s, it paid to modernize Canadian communications interception facilities. In his 1996 book, Target Nation, Canada and the Western Intelligence Network, James Littleton writes, much of the Signals Intelligence Agency intelligence material collected by Canada is transmitted directly to the US National Security Agency, where it is interpreted, stored, and retained. Much of it is not first processed and analyzed in Canada. So that's a little bit of a link there. Radhika Desai will discuss the relationship of the Five Eyes to the Anglosphere and European settler colonialism, as well as the role that the Five Eyes have played in stoking conflict with China. And Yves Engler will be speaking more broadly about how the Five Eyes fit into Canadian foreign policy. So that will be our evening for tonight, followed by Q&A. And our first speaker of the evening, very excited to present Bill Robinson. Bill is a Citizen Lab Research Fellow and expert on the communication security establishment. You can follow his writing at luxxumbra, blogspot.com. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been paying attention to CSE for at least 35 years, I'd say. And in that time, it's become a little more public than it was at the time, but still a very, very secretive organization. Polls suggest that only 3% of Canadians actually are able to name the communication security establishment. So congratulations to those of you who are watching this, because I think probably you already have at least that knowledge of what's going on. So that puts you in an elite group within this country who actually have heard of this organization. Congratulations on that. They haven't made it easy to know what this organization is all about. So I've been asked to give a kind of introduction to the history and role of the organization. So I'll talk about its mandate and briefly look at the history in relationship to the other Five Eyes, and talk about some of the major changes in its role and activities over its history. And finally, maybe get in some comments on the review and oversight agencies that exist now, if I haven't used up all my time, which I probably will. Apologies ahead of time if I lapse into acronyms and jargon in this business, because it's full of it and I've been steeped in it for decades now, and I really have a hard time not talking in that language. So to start out, CSE is Canada's National Cryptologic Agency, or as they describe themselves, Canada's national lead for foreign signals intelligence and cyber operations and technical authority for cybersecurity. And if that doesn't help much, I'm not too surprised, because it's pretty jargony itself. There's four major roles that the agency has. The first is collecting foreign intelligence about foreign agencies, countries, individuals, using signals intelligence, which is the monitoring of other people's communications, and also more recently, the hacking into their computer systems and stealing data and so forth. The second major role is providing cybersecurity advice, guidance, and services to the Canadian government for the protection of Canadian government systems and also systems of importance to the government of Canada, which would tend to be critical infrastructure in Canada. They also provide some advice to the general public on cybersecurity issues. The third major role is support to law enforcement and security agencies of the federal government. And this is where the potential for being involved in surveillance that implicates a lot of Canadians comes in, because this is not just foreign intelligence. This is law enforcement and security agencies doing their thing through CSE. And the fourth area is, since 2019, the agency has been empowered to do cyber operations, computer network attack, it's sometimes called, or as the agency itself refers to it, active cyber operations, which are offensive in nature, and defensive cyber operations, which ostensibly are more defensive in nature, but are in both cases involve striking at the computer systems and data and whatnot of foreign entities, states and individuals. So going back to the history, signals intelligence of the kind we understand really appeared with the invention of radio. There had been stealing diplomatic letters all through history and decrypting them and so forth. But in terms of industrial level monitoring of communications, this really arrived with the arrival of radio, and it really became big with the Second World War. And that's when Canada became involved in a major way. We were involved in collecting radio communications and sharing them with allies, and also involved in actually processing that material, breaking codes, and reporting on the intelligence collected. And even at that time, we did it very much in concert with allies. So in 1941, for example, when the examination unit was created, a small unit within the National Research Council, which was really the origins, you could say, of CSE, that agency ended up being run by a director who was supplied by the British. It was Government Communications, Government Cipher and Code School, which is the organization that's now GCHQ, which Bianca mentioned, Government Communications Headquarters. And I will probably end up throwing around these acronyms all the time. You can't avoid it. And that agency, the examination unit, ended up actually working more with the Americans than with the British. We worked with both, but mainly because our interception activities were focused in North America. So it'd be Japanese naval and military activities, diplomatic activities, and it was the Axis German naval operations in the Atlantic and so forth. We were more involved with the American agencies, and so we were getting assignments on what areas to work on, what areas to collect on from the American agencies, even in the Second World War. So we've always really been in this business as part of a larger allied system. There's no time to talk about all that, but when the war ended, even before the war ended, the United States and Britain had agreed to carry forth that kind of intimate cooperation in signals intelligence into the post-Cold War world. And the primary target of that, of course, was going to be the Soviet Union, because that's what they perceived as was going to be the major challenge that they faced in the coming decades. Although the entire world was essentially the target of this intelligence alliance, but the primary target was the Soviet Union. And so even by the fall of 1945, they had essentially agreed to the formal agreement that formalized their post-war cooperation, and it was signed in March 5th, 1946, so very early after the war. Known originally as the BRUSA Agreement, B-R-U-S-A, and more recently, soon after really, it was renamed the UK-USA Agreement, or UKUSA Agreement. And this is the fundamental document of the Five Eyes signals intelligence cooperation. Actually, it was signed only between the US and the UK, but the other countries involved, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were already mentioned in that agreement, and Canada specifically by name, and they had agreed, by the time it was signed, those countries had agreed to cooperate with its terms. So really, we were all part of that broader agreement, although not all signatories of it. And for those of us who've been looking at this agency for a long time, UKUSA is actually the term that we used for ages when describing this five-power arrangement. It was the UKUSA partners, the UKUSA countries. The term Five Eyes really only appeared around the beginning of the 2000s as a public term. And so for me, it's still a little bit new to be talking about Five Eyes. And UKUSA is the name that resonates with me. But on the other hand, one thing that's true is that the Five Eyes represents agreement on all kinds of different levels of intelligence and security cooperation and law enforcement cooperation. Whereas the Yakuza agreement, which was kind of the granddaddy of this all, was a signals intelligence agreement. And it's among the signals intelligence agencies that this cooperation really became fundamental and as close as it did. But it has spread into this broader level of cooperation on all these levels of foreign policy, defense, security, intelligence. So the Five Eyes term is applicable to that whole broad range. So the actual immediate predecessor, actually the agency which is now CSC originally began as the communications branch of the National Research Council. It was a part of the National Research Council. Excuse me. And that actually began at the beginning of September 1946. That's when it was set up. The post-war agencies had just carried through until that point, and they were rolled into this new agency, which developed then. So by the time CSC, under this earlier name CBNRC, was created, it was already integrated into this post-war global system. And it was always part of that. Very early on for Canada, CBNRC, CSC focused exclusively, essentially exclusively, on the Soviet Union, and in particular on the northern part of the Soviet Union, especially after November 1957, it was almost exclusively on that. But what would happen is we would put that kind of information into the broader intelligence pool of the partners. And in return for that, we had access to all kinds of reports from all kinds of different countries from these signals intelligence partners. And also as we became broader intelligence partners from other intelligence agencies of these partners. So for example, we may have produced in a typical year, say 10,000 signals intelligence reports, but Canada had access to about 100,000 to as many as 200,000 reports from their partners, largely from the NSA, mostly from the NSA, which was by far the largest of these partners, the American agency. Also from GCHQ, which was much larger than the other small countries put together, but really from the total arrangement. So Canada was putting a small amount in for a larger access, and this was always been seen in Canada as the major benefit of participation in this system. Now I'd better move this along. So that was the Cold War. In 1975, in 1974, there was a major revelation about the existence of CBNRC, parliamentary discussion and so forth. People said, why is this in our scientific organization? And in 1975, it was moved into the Department of National Defense and renamed the Communications Security Establishment, which is its current name. So that's how it got out of being CBNRC. In 2011, it actually became a standalone agency. So it's no longer part of the Department of National Defense. It's its own agency. But it's still under the Minister of National Defense, who's in charge of it. It's not part of the Department of National Defense. That's where it stands at the moment. And as the Cold War was coming to an end, the agency was diversifying its targets somewhat. It started to put collection into various embassies around the world, monitoring sites. It started to monitor satellite systems as part of the Yakuza or Five Eyes echelon system, and so forth. And that stood them in pretty good stead when 1991 came along, because of course its primary target, the Soviet Union, suddenly folded up and was gone. And so that was a big change for CSC, because it was still its primary target, and it was poof. That was not the end of interest in what happens in Russia and former Soviet countries by far, but it nevertheless was the end of the primary focus of Five Eyes on that target. So we moved into that decade, you may remember it, before 9/11 and after the Cold War, when everyone, or a lot of people, were claiming it was all going to be economic competition between countries. And history was over and what have you. And in fact, CSC became very focused on what they called prosperity issues, in other words, economic targeting for that decade. Then 9/11 came along, and boom, it was security, terrorism, counterterrorism, also support to military operations, which had started in the 1990s with all the big UN operations, but moved on to Afghanistan, Iraq, all the rest of the support to military operations part. So that became very big after 9/11. And also what is an even bigger explanation for what happened with CSE is the internet arrived. And it totally changed the SIGINT world. What had been monitoring of mostly radio communications was suddenly monitoring packet switched communications primarily over cable, fiber optic cables, or collecting it later through cell phone systems and collecting it through Wi-Fi, locally through Wi-Fi connections and so forth. Totally different kinds of collection, totally different kinds of targets, mainly terrorist style things, hiding out within the broader civilian communications, not so much government to government. Hacking into computers, which was a totally different thing for signals intelligence agencies. Instead of sitting there and collecting whatever radio messages came by, this was going out into finding people's computer systems, hacking into them and stealing the information there. So that totally changed the name of the game in the signals intelligence world. And that changed CSE dramatically. There was a passage of a bill called the Anti-Terrorism Act in 2001, just after 9/11, which gave whole new powers to CSE. And also it was given a massive increase in its budget to hire people. It came out of the Cold War with about 900 people. It now has about 3,000. It's never really stopped growing ever since that period. Largely because its targets have kept growing. It's also grown somewhat on the cybersecurity side because just as it's become good at breaking into people's computers, other countries have become good at breaking into our computers. So it's spending a lot more attention on that too. But the signals intelligence, the intelligence side is still 70% of what CSE does. Okay, that was a huge change for CSE, totally changed the nature of it. And now we've had one other major change until we get to today, and that's in 2019. Hope I haven't run out of time yet. I'm getting there. In 2019, we had the passage of the National Security Act 2017, which was introduced in 2017, passed in 2019, which included the CSE Act, a whole new statutory mandate for CSE, among other changes that happened in that act. More powers for CSE, including the power to conduct offensive cyber operations, because it's just the computer network attack I was talking about, which they call active cyber operations and defensive cyber operations. So that's only started since 2019, halfway through 2019. Very new power. Where they're going to go with that still remains to be seen, or not seen, because they're not really willing to talk about it very much. But it's out there. We have a little bit of intelligence about what's been going on, which is they have to have ministerial authorizations for these operations, both for the active ones, ACO, and defensive ones, DCO. They've been getting one authorization a year, one in 2019 for ACO, one for DCO, and the same last year, one for ACO, one for DCO, which tells us really only one thing, which is they're getting omnibus authorizations here, which cover a massive range of activities. So it doesn't tell us very much, but it tells us that probably the whole oversight mechanism, which we were promised, which was the global affairs, was going to have to approve each of these operations, as well as national defense, is probably a bit of a sham, because it means that global affairs signs off on some massive omnibus thing, and then they'll talk to them next year when it runs out. There is, I guess I have a moment to talk about the watchdog agencies. There are some for CSE. The first one was created in 1996, actually, way back then, called the Office of the Communications Security Establishment Commissioner. It was supposed to check the lawful compliance of CSE. I think it did a lot of good work over the years. It wasn't really inclined to call CSE out very much. Mostly, if it's thought there was a problem, it mostly dealt with it behind the scenes with CSE, and then said, we're talking about it, and then eventually said, okay, we're fine. That's been replaced as part of the 2019 Act. there's a whole new agency for the entire Canadian intelligence community. This is actually a rather good development called the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. Replaces CERC, which used to look after CSIS also. I know I'm getting into the acronyms, no time. It replaced all those, so that has, but it's just started to look at these things. So it's the one that has told us that there have been these 2 authorizations per year, 1 each for ACO, DCO. We wouldn't even know that if we didn't have NSA. And it's taking specific looks at what CSE is doing in this area, but it hasn't had a chance to report that yet. And when it reports, it'll be redacted, of course, for various secrets, but it will be able to say something. One thing it has been able to say so far, excuse me, one thing it's been able to say so far is that it does not agree with CSE, that CSE has looked at all the aspects of international law that may apply to this properly. There is an issue that these operations may not be legal under international law. And this looks like it's going to be a dispute between NSA and CSE on this very issue. Now, I should note for you that if it ends up that the courts finally rule on this in some way and they agree international law doesn't permit these operations, the CSE Act will be modified, and it'll be modified to permit it to do it despite international law. So these operations are going to happen. And the government is going to make it such that these operations continue happening. But the issue is out there right now, whether or not, in fact, they're legal at this moment, because the law was written in such a way that it didn't cover that contingency about whether or not international law applies. This was pointed out at the time the act was being discussed in Parliament. The government didn't bother to change it for whatever reason, and now they may have to actually face that problem. But as I say, the odds are if they have to face up to it, they'll end up modifying the act. And that's what'll happen with that. So nonetheless, these agencies, I think, are useful. They're an important service. They do raise the question of how much that you're concerned about, is it really about the legality, and how much is of concern that's legal anyway, or would be legal, or would be made legal? And is it still of concern even if it's been made legal? I think those are issues. So I think it's an interesting discussion we'll have tonight, and maybe I'll just leave my part of it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bill, for that just comprehensive and invaluable overview of the history of the CSE. And many thanks to you for having followed it so diligently and closely over the years. And now on the 75th anniversary of the CSE, there's lots now that's on Bill's Twitter. So you should all check that out. I posted his Twitter handle in the chat, and also his blog there, LuxX Umbra. I also want to remind people that if you have questions for our speakers, please post them in the Q&A box, because we'll be taking those later. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from you in the discussion period, Bill. So our next speaker of the evening is Josh Klein, who's going to be discussing the lead agency, the driving force of the Five Eyes, the NSA. Dr. Joshua Klein is an associate professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Sociology at Iona College. His research interests include attitudes and culture relating to criminal justice and violence, particularly state and corporate crime. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you so much. So I really appreciate that introduction, Bill, and I learned a lot. My research is not strictly on the NSA. I've been doing research for a long time on culture and empire and imperialism, and so I'm fitting my comments into that approach. So I'm really talking in an abstract, big picture way here. I'm not going to talk about specific policies and technologies. I'm skimming the surface at a high altitude, you might say. So I think that the thing to know or to think about all this is that we're talking here about the governments, and I'm going to use the word state to mean government here. That's a typical social theory, political theory way to talk. The role of the state and corporate surveillance systems in an age of neoliberal global capitalism. This is the framework that I'm using to think about this, and I think this is the way to think about this. My main point is that the NSA and Five Eyes are engaged in increasing whatever they're doing moment to moment, week to week. In the long run, they're engaged in increasing power over populations, primarily to preserve a predatory and unjust socioeconomic system and upper class power. So that's not a conspiracy. It's not a handful of culprits. And it's also not that everybody is all blindly, strangely arriving at unintended consequences with equal power, right? It's a system of unequal power and predation is very important. That is a few taking advantage of the many. So in our computerized an online world, we have an endless war on terror, wars on crime. These tend to be influenced or used by large corporations and allied governments to enforce and legitimate this social system. And the social system we live in globally, I'm speaking now generally, is one that is contradictory, destructive, and materially benefits a few at the expense of the many. So that's the background to think about NSA and CSE. What I'm going to do is just tell a couple of anecdotes, a couple of stories that will seem a little off topic maybe, but they are ancient history. One story is literally ancient history. The other one is half as old. And they're just vignettes or anecdotes that I think symbolize the long-standing patterns or structures that are behind what we're thinking about tonight. So the ancient story. A cryptographer named Yardley in 1912 worked at the US State Department. Soon after he started there, the US entered World War I. Yardley, at the time, was ambitious, and he saw a better future in the War Department, working with the War Department, which is obviously, as we know, the precursor to our Department of Defense, right, in the United States. He saw a better future in the War Department, which he felt would, quote, soon rule America, unquote. This is a technologist at a time when the military establishment in the United States, military-industrial complex, was just being born. And he's all excited that he's going to have a better career because it will rule America, the War Department. A few years later, in 1919, in order to eavesdrop on foreign communications and to create a large permanent organization, so this is the end of World War I, and this is what I'm describing here is the precursor to NSA. World War I ends, and instead of saying, okay, we should shut down shop, we should shut down this operation, right, this spying operation, the decision on the part of our government in the United States is to expand to make it permanent, right? So in 1919, to eavesdrop on foreign communications and create a permanent organization, Yardley was given the job of writing a memo about creating a peacetime organization. This organization later became, strangely, got called the Black Chamber. You gotta love this, you can't make this stuff up. This Black Chamber at the time had a budget, 60% of which came from the War Department and 40% from the State Department. Probably, according to the source I got used to get this is probably the US's first secret intelligence budget. Yardley proceeds to do this work. He's actually based in a brownstone, I just found this out, here in New York, probably not far from where I'm sitting. And to make extra money, he forms his own company. He calls it the Code Compilation Company, and he has them, I think it's on the first floor of the brownstone. And that company is selling code commercially. So in the same building, he's doing this work spying on foreign interests and also making money on the side in a commercial enterprise. So just to expand this story a little bit, or maybe go into more detail about a piece of it. In 1919, the US government wants to have a secret liaison. This is the language of the researcher I'm drawing on here. A secret liaison with Western Union Telegraph Company to provide needed messages. They tried for 6 months to get the company to agree to give messages to the government, right? But the reason that they can't get them to agree is the company's worried about something called the Radio Communications Act, which has penalties for telegraph company employees who divulge contents of a message. Again, this sounds like something out of a bad movie. Yardley meets with the company president who then Yardley says, quote, seemed anxious to do everything he could for us, unquote. Presumably this is not a scene in a gangster movie where Yardley threatened his family, but one can't help thinking that this was a case of a government official going to a corporate head and saying, we're going to make your life miserable if you don't go along with us, and we're doing something important and special and noble and so on and so forth. By the way, just a tidbit about this. This is literally ancient, right? Over 100 years old. The messages, once the company agreed, were hand delivered, right? They were paper hand delivered messages, rather quaint. All right, here's my other story. It's half as old, roughly. In 1969, President Nixon had a journalist named Joseph Kraft's phone bugged. Kraft was one of the most eminent US journalists at the time. He knew Kissinger well enough to call him Henry, and actually did know him. Apparently other people called him Henry, but didn't know Chris Kissinger that well. Kissinger, we'll remember, was a top government official for many years and at the heart of nuclear strategizing and Cold War aggression, really. Kraft was a journalist. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, lived in an elite area in Washington, D.C. So here's a journalist who is very close to the power elite. I think it's perfectly reasonable to conclude shares many of their values, but somehow he gets spied on because something he said, or something he wrote probably annoyed President Nixon. There was a government investigation which found no evidence of the White House claim that bugging this person, was for national security purposes. In 1974, House of Representatives committee supporting impeachment of Nixon has Kraft talking. In their report, they quote Kraft. And Kraft says, quote, I do not understand why I was made the subject of the wiretapping. I'm only sure that a monster has been allowed to grow up, and unless it is subject to regular control by impartial persons, I think all of us will be the victims, unquote. So what's the point of these two stories? I think these two stories remind us of a few characteristics, both of capitalist politics and of government surveillance more specifically, right? Most obviously, both of these little stories, if you compare what they're describing to today's US NSA and the Canadian CSA and Five Eyes, Yardley's century-ago collusion with a telegraph company and the monster that Kraft talked about would look like little furry caterpillars, right? They would be cute little, I was going to use the metaphor of an amoeba, right? The scale we're talking about here just is, it's laughable that these are two stories about people engaging in theft of information or secret surveillance, and at least one of them it was worried about this being a monster, right, compared to today. So just to focus on Canada, I think Canada, very much like the US, I think we know this, has been using the war on terror to increase control over the whole population, right? We're talking about threat inflation, exaggeration of threats, and so on. So folks who are in this webinar know better than I do. Canada, in recent years, the Canadian government has dismissed concerns about the communications security establishment. Five Eyes global operations has been described as having no oversight, international oversight, working globally or internationally at least, but its oversight is national, right? In other words, Canadian government has jurisdiction, but the mere fact that legally, formally, nobody has jurisdiction over much of what CSE does is of concern. Canada expanded, just like the US did under our Patriot Act, the legal definition of terrorism, it looks like my 10 minutes is up. Can I go a little bit more here? Is that all right?
That's totally fine.
Okay, I'm going to try to wrap up. I planned way too much, of course. Anyway, Canada expanded its definition of terrorism, proposed legislation. I don't know if this was passed. I'm sure folks in our webinar with me would know, but it's concerning even that it was attempted, would define as terrorist any activity interfering with the capacity of the government in relation to economic or financial stability. This is very broad language. Laws get reinterpreted by the powerful all the time, regardless of their language, but it's easier to do that if the language is broad. Then the other thing I was going to talk about, I think Radhika is going to talk about this, so I probably shouldn't spend more than a few seconds on it, is the question of China, which was mentioned when I was invited to this panel. And I just want to point out that the supposed threat of China is a perfect example of distracting people with nationalist rhetoric, right? Current claims about China's threats to US and global security are an example of threat inflation being used to frighten a population into supporting political and military aggression. And I was reading one source talking about this a few years back, not too long ago, the schizophrenic US policy before and after 9/11 regarding China. So on the one hand, calling China a serious foreign policy threat, at the same time, US corporations are having an absolute field day, a joyous profit fest, going in and investing in China and making use of its cheap labor and helping it become a top economic power, right? And I think I have to stop there, but let me say that the point I'm trying to make about China is that when we hear all the horrible hacking and naughty things that they have done, and Russia too, and et cetera, you've got to keep in mind that at the same time, our national leaders in the US and in Canada are telling us to be afraid of some other national, some other nation. We have something approaching, if not actually comprising, a transnational capitalist class in this world that really does not think in national terms unless they have to. And so it's a little bit jarring to realize that when we hear about, those the Chinese, they're so evil. First of all, the US has probably done it more. The example being election meddling that we've heard about in recent years about Russia doing. Some study recently said that over the last half century, the US has at least 80 times meddled in elections, not military or covert action, meddling in financing of parties and such. Anyway, so the point being that China's threat is very much manufactured to keep most of us thinking in national terms, while the people that really have much power, most of the power in this world, are thinking in global terms and could care less. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joshua. It was really interesting for me to hear that elaboration on the NSA, its history, and just understanding better the power dynamics as well, and sort of the dubious nature of those. And thank you for connecting also to Canada's CSE and the so-called threat of China, as well as the lack of internationalism that we're seeing. So thank you. I look very forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. So our next speaker of the evening is Professor Radhika Desai. Dr. Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. Welcome, Radhika.
Thanks very much, Bianca, and thanks also to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. It's a great honor for me to aid in your work. I'm a great admirer of everything you're doing. So the rough title I've given for my remarks is Five Eyes, the Anglosphere Resurfaces. My remarks will concentrate on the bigger picture of the history of capitalism and imperialism. Why has this shadowy outfit, which has led a submarine existence for so long, surfaced into public view recently? What does it have to do with the United States' new Cold War on China, in which its efforts to involve all and sundry are having at best mixed results? What does it have to do with the announcement of AUKUS, the alliance between the Australia, United States, and the United Kingdom? Is there really an Anglosphere, as so many commentators suggest? While there may be many good questions to be asked about the broad set of issues we are talking about, asking why the Anglosphere is surfacing right now is likely to yield many insights. I'm going to make that the driving question of my presentation. My argument today is that Five Eyes and the larger formations going beyond intelligence or even defense that the sort of so-called Anglosphere represents are legacy structures that are under pressure amid the unfolding contradictions of capitalism in the world order. The new Cold War against China prompted by the economic and geopolitical threat it represents to a weakening capitalism, is the most important symptom of what I'm talking about. Incidentally, while the merits of the label Cold War may be debated, there is one major parallel. Both the Soviet Union in its time and China today are major economic and geopolitical threats to capitalism and leading capitalist countries, in the sense that they represent a sort of limit beyond which capitalism cannot expand, and capitalism is inherently expansive. Only the condescension to which the post-Cold War world has consigned the Soviet Union makes the present situation with China appear altogether novel. In reality, no sooner than it had become world-girding in the early 20th century, capitalism entered its greatest crisis, a crisis spanning 3 decades that the historian Arno Meyer termed the 30 Years crisis, spanning from 1914 to 1945. And it was a crisis of both capitalism and imperialism. The same logic of uneven and combined development, that is to say, economic domination and imperialism on the one hand, and resistance to it on the other through state-led industrialization. So this logic, which first industrialized new powers such as the United States, Germany, and Japan against the domination of Britain, which had been the first industrializer. This happened in the late 19th century. By the early 20th century, the same logic was producing socialist challenges, as well as the nationalist challenges that created the Third World. Cold Wars, old and new, against socialism and for the allegiance of the newly independent countries of the Third World were only chapters in the history of imperialism, and so is the new Cold War. Now, I said that was incidental, but actually that's the historical theoretical bit packed into a single paragraph. We can talk about it more later, and therefore it was not incidental at all. To return to outlining my argument, the Anglo-American sphere is resurfacing as a result of the pressures of China's rise and the new Cold War that, as a consequence, the United States has launched against it, and in which it would like to enlist every other power possible. The process is placing the citizens of the Five Eyes member states not only in great danger of having their human rights violated through the surveillance network and whatnot, but is also placing their very security at risk. By indulging in the new Cold War against China through Five Eyes and associated activities, including AUKUS, etc., our governments are violating their most basic duty towards us to secure our economic and military safety in the international order. This is what is being wagered in a larger game where the real interests that are being secured by our governments are not our interests, not our most basic economic and security interests, but are securing the interests of big corporations. I will make my argument by answering 5 questions. First, what is Five Eyes? What is the Anglosphere? What is the relation, etc.? So, as you know, as Bianca has already said, and I won't repeat it, Five Eyes came to our attention in the 2010s, particularly with Edward Snowden's leaks, and we've seen what Snowden said about it. And we also know that, of course, over the last year or two, explicit discussion of Five Eyes has become very prominent. Much has been written about how hard it is to define Five Eyes. Is it an alliance? Is it a treaty? Is it a network? Is it a strategic partnership? Is it something else? What we do know, and I think that both Bill and Joshua have said enough about it that I don't have to go into details, but what we do know is that it's a relatively informal and unstructured outfit. Five Eyes per se refers to the intelligence and security aspects that work in the tradition of what one may call a sort of gentleman's agreement, provided we bear in mind that these people are not gentlemen in any widely understood sense of the term. They're really cads or robber barons, but that's another story altogether. Gentlemen always were that anyway, so-called gentlemen. So the Five Eyes network and the broader alliance of the Anglosphere that increasingly people are talking about is justified in the name of common culture. So, for example, the heads of GCHQ and the National Security Agency say that our alliance is built on a history of strong shared values, including respect for privacy, and the rule of law, There was an article in The Hill, which is a publication out of Washington, D.C., which said the following: the United Kingdom and major English-speaking dominations of the former British Empire are united by a shared tradition of English common law and the individual political and economic freedoms that flow from it. Of course, what they really mean are the political and economic freedoms of the big corporations, forget everybody else. The quote continues, the Anglosphere's institutional and geographical heterogeneity belies a practical geostrategic closeness that Brussels, that is to say the European Union, cannot begin to match. So here we are clearly seeing the Anglosphere being set apart from continental Europe. Not necessarily a bad thing, but in this case, it is a bad thing. Further, the quote goes on, the Anglosphere alliance is simply the most important foreign policy reality that nobody is talking about it. Of course, now everybody is talking about it. For example, and most tellingly, in all of the major geostrategic contests in the last tumultuous century, the First and Second World Wars, the Cold War, much like a bickering Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, who nonetheless always came out shooting together, all the Anglosphere countries found themselves on the same side in every contest. This record of strategic closeness is unparalleled and it is not an accident, close quote. This is all in The Hill. This is how it's being justified. People take it for granted that there is some sort of cultural closeness that is what we are talking about. But in reality, the commonality, insofar as there is a commonality that unites something called the Anglosphere, the commonality has not been as enduring as this suggests. And there has been a certain, what I would call a political and geopolitical economy underlying it. So the second question then is, what is this political and geopolitical reality that underlies it? To me, all this talk of Anglosphere is a little problematic. The key relationship here is UK and US closeness. The dominions, when they were still dominions, were carried along by the UK in the past. Today, their involvement is at least controversial for at least two of them. We know that New Zealand has increasingly been trying to sort of edge itself out of it, or at least take some distance from these ideas of Five Eyes, Anglosphere, etc., these institutions and ideas. Australia, by the way, is divided. There is a hilarious interview, absolutely stunning interview with former Prime Minister Paul Keating, who basically says that Australians have lost their way, that this new AUKUS deal, which is part of this burgeoning Anglosphere that we're talking about, it will be whenever if and when the nuclear powered submarines are delivered, it will be like throwing matchsticks at a mountain. So there is division here, and I would say Canada should be divided too. And there are traces of division within Canada as well. We can discuss that. So what defines the Anglo-American axis is actually a reality. And if we look at it, we are not going to feel particularly attracted to this. It is not this respect for privacy and rule of law. This is what it is. Number one, a failing political and geopolitical economy of neoliberalism. That is to say, a productively weak economy is dominated by financializations that are deeply contradictory. They threaten to explode once again, even more destructively, as they have done repeatedly. The entire neoliberal period has been a series of ever more destructive financial crises. And by the way, this is the gist of the inflation debate today, because the moment the Fed starts tightening monetary policy, we can expect a big financial meltdown. So basically, this type of political economy must be rejected even by the citizens of the UK and the US. But certainly, if they remain closely wedded to it, at least the rest of us, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, must reject it first. The Europeans are already beginning to part ways with this Anglosphere, with its political economy and also with its military doctrines, etc. That is why the Anglo-American axis has become more prominent, because this is decisively threatening NATO. As you know, Emmanuel Macron was absolutely threw a fit when the AUKUS alliance was announced, because Australia cancelled deals with them. No, this is really only about a month or two away, and already France has been engaging in a frenzy of military deal making with all sorts of powers, whether it is Greece or various Gulf states and what have you. So they are essentially plowing now a different furrow. The fact that it's threatening NATO is neither here or there for me, because I've argued before that its incoherence was already mounting in recent decades anyway. So the new Cold War has been prompted by this economic and diplomatic failure, and the new Cold War itself and the underlying militarism is itself incoherent, because when you look at American strategy, I mean, you look at the shambles that is the withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, most recently, but also essentially defeat in Iraq and elsewhere, defeat in Vietnam. I mean, ever since Vietnam, every American government has been obsessed with this idea of undoing the Vietnam syndrome. Well, you went from Saigon to Kabul, and that has been the result. So it's basically, it looks as though there is actually no grand strategy of American empire. It is actually just a way of feeding the military industrial complex. And in my own work, particularly my book, Geopolitical Economy, I've written about this. It seems as though this has, in a certain sense, always been the case, which explains the fact that the Americans have never won a single war. I'm sorry to say, apart from little countries like Grenada or Panama, it has not been able to overrun any other country. So the military industrial complex is essentially the tail that wags the dog that is all American people. So there have been a long string of military failures. And what's more, America's way of essentially waging what I call capital-intensive warfare is essentially bound to fail against people who are willing to fight for their independence, fight for their country. This has been demonstrated repeatedly. And also the United States has been able to do this because, in a certain sense, throughout the post-71 period, it has lived under a regime in which the world has been pleased to lend it money. It has been a sinkhole for the world's money. I would say that is soon also going to end. Indeed, the pressures you are now seeing, the lack of approval of the stimuli and so on, this is all happening because the free money is going to end. And of course, it is stoking domestic instability, particularly in the US and the UK, and to a lesser extent in our country. So the third question, how did this alliance come into being? This alliance has come into being. So some dated from the end of the Second World War, some to the First World War. I would say it's actually part of the complex relations that are not captured by theories of globalization and US hegemony, which are all a bunch of rubbish. You have to look at the real history instead. It originated in a logic that culminated in the Second World War and formed the substance of what I have called the 30 Years crisis. It included improvement, beginning with an improvement of US-UK relations in the late 19th century that led to enormous British financing of American industrialization, and also the industrialization of other settler colonies such as Canada and Australia, on the backs of, I would like to underline, on the backs of, at the expense of the non-settler colonies such as British India, such as Africa, the Caribbean, elsewhere. The US very early on saw that UK power was weakening, and it began to nurse the ambition of replacing the UK as the managing segment of the world economy. In the pursuit of this ambition, it began also to financialize its own economy on the model of the UK and its pound sterling system, which led directly to the 1929 crash. And between 1929 and the early 80s, the United States had among the most highly regulated financial systems in the world. That so in a certain sense, it could not possibly repeat what had happened then. But nevertheless, then you had, at the end of the Second World War, which gave the United States a temporary relative dominance for a very simple reason, because the United States had acted as the United States economy has boomed during the Second World War. It acted as a supplier of war material to the warring Europeans and others. So in this capacity, the United States economy doubled between 1939 and 1945, when the rest of the world were destroying their economy. So naturally, American economy was the biggest, and blah, blah, and so on. More than half the world's production, blah, blah, etc. But this was only going to be a temporary situation. But in this context, the United States imposed a deal on Britain with her empire and so on. So, and this has often been sort of called a special relationship, but as people like to joke, critics like to joke in the United Kingdom. Only the United Kingdom thinks it has a special relationship with the US. If you ask American officials, they say, what special relationship? We have nothing. Because what did the Americans do? First of all, they tried to do the British out of whatever they should have rightly got from their joint development of nuclear weapons. In return for loans, they got access to Britain's vast imperial network of military bases. And finally, they tried to impose a set of repayment terms that were essentially meant to throttle the British economy and the British Empire. Don't think it would be a great exaggeration to say that the process of negotiating these loans essentially led Keynes to his ill health and eventually his heart attack, which is essentially it took his life. So that's what the special relationship is. So these are the complex things that are really at the bottom of what people like to call the Anglosphere and the nice common interests and so on. So essentially then over the next little while, US power naturally declined. British power also declined. It decolonized. Its internationally most influential sector, the financial sector, was at its nadir. And of course, British industry was declining steadily since the 1870s. Britain suffered the ignominy of Suez and a couple of devaluations in the 40s and 60s. And by the 70s, even US power was at its nadir. The dollar had to come off cold. Vietnam, there was a defeat in Vietnam. Britain, in this context, joined the European Union. I won't say more about this, but I want you to keep this in mind. This was a world economy that was a golden age economy. There were many good things about it. The chief thing that was good about it is that on the whole, economies of the world were focused on production, not on finance. But this was about to change. And this has to do with the fourth question, why has the Anglosphere recently resurfaced? So it has resurfaced as a result of developments going back to the 70s. There were basically two things that happened in the 1970s, the lifting of capital controls by the United States and the Volcker shock in the late 1970s. Between them, they laid the foundations on which neoliberalism would build a very financialized type of economy, something that Michael Hudson and I, in our recent paper called Beyond Dollar Creditocracy, we call the dollar creditocracy. It's a dollar-denominated international financial system that has visited only deprivation on most of the working classes of the Western world, as well as, of course, the third world. So all of the third world. So essentially, this is the kind of economy neoliberalism has created. Productively weak, the only strong sector is finance. And what is finance? It's a form of predation. It's a form of robber baron capitalism. And what's interesting about the Anglosphere and neoliberalism is that neoliberalism went the farthest in the Anglosphere. They already were biased towards liberal policies anyway, thanks to empire and American desire to emulate empire, plus their first past the post electoral systems allowed winner-take-all governments to ram through radical programs of neoliberal policies that would not have been possible in Europe and have not been possible in Europe. And so essentially, European economies have historically been quite different because they were what I call contender industrializers. The state has always played a big role in their economy. And thanks to this, and thanks to their need to contest the dominance, first of Britain and later of the United States, there is a basis of social cohesion in these economies, which is relatively lacking in the neoliberal Anglosphere economies, where nobody cares about social cohesion whatsoever. And therefore, this has created Brexit and Trump. So I'm coming to the end of my talk. I'll just have one more minute. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that the so-called Anglosphere, if Canada remains, or let me rephrase that, taking the side of the Anglosphere, going along with AUKUS, Five Eyes, etc., is actually putting us on the wrong political economy as well as foreign policy path. So what is to be done? reverse all this, demand an end to new Cold Wars against Russia and China. We are not prepared to fight them. What is the point of threatening them if we are not really prepared to fight them? All we do is we create international tensions, which then increase the possibility that there will be war. And it also prevents us from engaging productively with the rest of the world, particularly those parts of the world that retain strong productive economies. And China, of course, is the foremost among them. We have to demand withdrawal from NATO and other such alliances, Five Eyes, Anglosphere, AUKUS, whatever our respective countries are part of. And more broadly, we have to begin to shift away from neoliberalism and financialization that has also gone hand in hand with militarism of the most destructive kind. So I hope that was interesting, and I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. What a total wealth of knowledge you are. Thank you for giving us the bigger picture and, for pointing us in the direction of the shifts that are needed, with regards to the political economy, the neoliberalism driving these projects, and also for illuminating these special relationships and the changing nature of the so-called Anglosphere. And also all of this within the context of, conflict with China. It truly is a scary time, and we should all be very concerned about conflict with the world's most populous nation and stoking that. So for folks at home, Radhika has authored several books. There's people asking about this in the chat, including Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. Please do find out more about her work. And I'm looking so forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. So the next speaker of the evening is Yves Engler. Yves is an author and an activist based in Montreal. His most recent book is titled Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. Thank you, Yves, for being here. Welcome, Yves.
Thank you. I'm speaking to everyone from traditional territory of the Tiohtià:ke, which has long been a place, meeting point and exchange among First Nations. So I'm just going to start off a little bit about just the Five Eyes and then get to the communications security establishment as part of Canadian foreign policy. And I just want to emphasize the point of the Five Eyes being a European settler colonial alliance, and the countries that initially refused to sign the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people were the four Five Eyes countries, minus Britain. And I think it's kind of remarkable that more anti-racist organizations don't highlight that point, especially in a context right now where the Five Eyes is being the justification for why we need to exclude Huawei from Canada, from Canada's 5G network, and other elements of sort of got to get tough on China. Even the NDP doesn't, seems to go along with that type of rhetoric, and doesn't really ever raise this question of, what is the Five Eyes, and why isn't India part of the Five Eyes? Why isn't Nigeria part of the Five Eyes? There's more English speakers in those countries than there are in Canada, than there are in New Zealand. And so I think that's a question that we need to think about. But I think to me, the Five Eyes, as Radhika has kind of alluded to it or pointed out, to me, it's one of the alliances that is cited by forces in this country for their own political purposes, right? Like I don't think that those who are arguing that we have to get tough on China, necessarily are totally committed to the Five Eyes as an alliance. They're committed to getting tough on China. And they make the argument that, because our allies in the Five Eyes are saying that we need to get tough on China, therefore we need to get tough on China. And, there's a long history, right? Like often NATO is cited in Canadian foreign policy to justify, bombing Libya. Well, not all NATO countries joined in the bombing of Libya in 2011. And some NATO countries that participated only provided very small amounts of support. Canada was a major player in that war, and it was justified by our participation in NATO. But again, other NATO countries didn't do the bombing, and others just participated in much lesser ways. So I see the Five Eyes partly as this racist alliance that is the US and others are using now to target China, but it's both kind of real and not real, and at the same time, in that sense. But so what is quite concrete is the communication security establishment as a tool of Canadian foreign policy. And we've seen Bill, mentioned some of this earlier on. The CSE is playing a bigger role in military missions, right? In Afghanistan, in the war in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014, when Canadian troops were there in significant numbers, the head of the CSE said that claimed to be responsible for half of all what he called actionable intelligence used by Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan. In 2006, when there were Canadians that were rescued, that had been kidnapped in Iraq, same thing. The CSC said they were helped in providing intelligence for that operation. Presumably, when Canada bombed Libya in 2011, the CSC helped intelligence on that front, and other wars that Canada has been involved in and that Canada's allies have been involved in. Historically, we know from what Mike Frost, who was a former CSE agent, described in his mid-1990s book, that the CSE spied on Gaddafi's Libya. They spied on Fidel Castro's Cuba. Yasser Arafat's name, the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, was on every, as he put it, every CSE keyword list. More recently, Edward Snowden pointed out that Palestinians was a specific intelligence topic of the NSA, CSE, and the British intelligence partner in the Five Eyes, and that they shared that intelligence with the Israelis. So those countries, those political movements that are viewed as offside of Canadian foreign policy, US foreign policy, will tend to be targeted by the communications security establishment. Additionally, from at an economic level, we know that the CSE has been involved in intelligence gathering, economic intelligence gathering. It was reported that they were involved with the spying on the Brazilian Department of Mines and Energy that came out in the Snowden revelations. As The Guardian reported that time, it said that the CSE has participated in secret meetings in Ottawa where Canadian security agencies briefed energy corporations. Claims of spying on the Brazilian Mining and Energy Ministry by CSE come amid the Canadian government's increasingly aggressive promotion of resource corporations at home and abroad, including unprecedented surveillance and intelligence sharing with companies. So the CSE has played a role historically on economic espionage internationally, and I would presume, when we know what how much the Canadian foreign policy is oriented towards the mining sector, presumably the CSE is involved in some amount of espionage internationally on behalf, at the service of Canadian mining companies more broadly. Bill already raised the question of the fact that they've been given more powers in recent years for offensive operations, and that is definitely something that needs to be followed very closely. For me, the CSE, the question becomes, it's a tool of Canadian foreign policy, and it does have some element of a defensive element to it, and I think that I would agree that there is some role to play, of course, in defending Canadian companies, institutions, individuals from foreign hacking and stuff like that. So there would be some legitimacy in their operations there. But the real question comes down, the legitimacy of the communications security establishment, it comes down to is Canadian foreign policy legitimate? Right? Is it morally just? Is it about enhancing democracy, women's rights, et cetera, et cetera? And I would say usually that's not the case. So, for instance, when the CSE is boasting about its important role in Afghanistan, when Canadian troops are there, well, was Canada's military mission in Afghanistan a morally just affair? I would argue it wasn't. So when the CSE is providing intelligence, and so on one hand, they're protecting Canadian soldiers from potentially, being harmed by Taliban. But on the other hand, they're providing intelligence that Canadian forces are using in their nighttime assassination raids, or were using in their nighttime assassination raids in Afghanistan, that were responsible for significant human rights violations. Likewise, they were presumably providing intelligence that the Americans were using, because Canadian forces were calling in US airstrikes, and US airstrikes killed innumerable civilians in Afghanistan, was responsible for all kinds of destruction. So the legitimacy of the CSE's operations are really, in large part, dependent on the legitimacy of Canadian foreign policy. And I would suggest that that's consistently, those are immoral foreign policy operations. So yes, more oversight of the CSE. Yes, greater public, greater explanation of what they're doing. But ultimately, these questions come down to, is Canadian foreign policy morally just? And then just to sort of conclude, I mean, at the bigger picture, what the CSE and the Five Eyes does is it really ties Canada to belligerent US, and to a slightly lesser extent, British foreign policy, right? The US is a massive empire with military bases all around the world, has been responsible for innumerable examples of undermining democracy, of human rights violations. And the CSC and the Five Eyes really link Canada to that process. They also, as we're seeing, I think, particularly with China, they link ideologically, they link the Canadian government and elite opinion more generally with the British and US-led worldview, right? When we're talking about Huawei, to be very concrete, and how we need to ban Huawei from Canada's 5G network, we are talking about major Canadian corporations that are being harmed by that, right? Bell and Telus it's going to cost them more than $1 billion if the Liberal government does ban Huawei from the 5G network. Additionally, Huawei has major operations within Canada. Many, 1,600 employees, major research center. So there are real economic downside to banning that company. It also contravenes WTO rules even. But the logic of Canada being a participant in the Anglosphere, of being tied to American militarism, is superseding some narrow, important corporate interests on that question. So to sort of at the big picture, when we talk about the communication security establishment, we talk about the Five Eyes, we're talking about a tool that is advancing Canadian foreign policy. And despite all the rhetoric of human rights, democracy, Canadian foreign policy is fundamentally motivated by two major forces: support for empire, historically British, today American, and support for Canadian corporate interests abroad. And I see the Five Eyes and the CSC, Communication Security Establishment, as just a part of that foreign policy that Canadians, particularly people in allied countries as well, we need to be challenging. We need to be pushing to make the foreign policy more oriented towards what majority of Canadians want, and that is not antagonistic to the interests of the majority in the world I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yves. Thank you so much for putting both the Five Eyes and the CSE into the broader context of Canadian foreign policy, and for also boldly underlining that the CSE is an arm of Canadian foreign policy, and that and raising this issue and this question of its operations being legitimate to the extent that Canadian foreign policy itself is legitimate. So you can find out more about Yves' work at yvesengler.com. And that concludes our presentations for the evening. We are now moving on to the Q&A portion. We are going to try and take questions. We're running a little bit late, so I'm not going to be able to take as many as I would like to, but let's get into it. So the first question that we have today is from Shahira. And the question is, which Canadian laws regulate the function of this organization? And I think Shahira is referencing the CSE. So I'll first turn that over to you, Bill.
Okay. Well, there's a specific act which was passed in 2019 called the CSE Act, or Communications Security Establishment Act, which lays out its particular powers. Within that, though, it's still within the broader picture. It's subject to the Criminal Code. It's subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this has actually been brought into court in the past, in particular by the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. And that case was never finally resolved, but it was probably one of the reasons why the CSE Act was in fact put in front of Parliament, because it was, again, a sort of process, a bit like what I talked about with the offensive cyber activities. If it turns out they're pushing against what might really be legal, then the law gets changed to make sure it is legal. So the CSE Act basically legalized the concerns that the BCCLA had brought into court. But they're still subject to these questions of charter rights. So, for example, in terms of use of bulk metadata that might affect Canadian privacy, there's the potential that a legal process can look at that. So the review agencies, in fact, specifically examine legal questions. And I would say that there is a pretty good ethos of compliance with the law among these agencies. The only issue being, again, the law tends to get written for what they want to do anyway.
Radhika. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Bill particularly, because it seems to me that, does it really matter how many laws you make and how wonderful they are if you can always hide behind the shroud of secrecy? Because isn't secrecy being one of the main, so you can have all the laws you like, but if the activities of these people are to remain secret, then how are you supposed to enforce the law?
Yeah, that is a big problem, but the review agencies that we've established do have nominally complete access to the files and people of these agencies. Now, they've had fights over the years, in fact, getting that full access. And you'll see even in the most recent annual report of NSA, a certain amount of pushback against CSE in particular about how well they're behaving, but that tends to be fairly marginal. They have, in fact, very good access to the files of these agencies, and to when they want to examine a particular area, to get the data from those agencies, to see the legal opinions that Department of Justice has given to CSE about the interpretation of the Act and so on, to be able to take those opinions and bring their own legal experts in and examine them and critique them and so forth. So at that level, those agencies then are limited in what they can report to us, because there's that level of secrecy, but they can report in general terms that they agree that there's compliance or that they think there's a problem without giving us the details of what the problem is. But they're very useful as a bell ringer in that sense. They can say, look, we think there's a problem here. And once in a while, they've rung that bell. It's
Right, but it took somebody like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange to give us the real deal, so to speak.
well, certainly they would never release that level of detail to the public. They would argue you don't necessarily have to have that kind of detail in order to do the job that they do, because they see that kind of detail themselves.
Bill, on the note of the kind of job that they do, we have another question, which is, what is the difference between the CSC and CSIS?
Okay. CSIS is our security intelligence agency, which means it's mandated by law to deal with what they're called threats to the security of Canada. And that includes within Canada and outside of Canada. And threats to the security of Canada are defined within the CSIS Act to include military espionage, subversion, sabotage. I'm not a CSIS expert, so you'll have to read the Act or to go to someone who is to get the full details of that. But that's what CSIS does, and it's primarily a human intelligence organization, which means it spies on people and it gets people in other organizations to provide information to them and so forth. They also use technical means, which can include putting in wiretaps, and they also can call on CSC to do its kind of signals intelligence collection on their behalf. That's CSIS. So it operates within Canada, largely, also abroad, but largely within Canada. And it's the one that might look at looks at it, environmental groups, for example, sometimes, but also looks at terror issues within Canada and so on. CSE, as I said earlier, its principal area is signals intelligence. That's monitoring communications and breaking into computers. And it is specifically mandated to do that only outside Canada with non-Canadians, except when it's working under what's called its mandate C, which is support to federal law enforcement and security agencies, in which case it just works basically as an extension of CSIS. CSIS has to then bring a warrant. CSIS needs judges' warrants to spy on people in Canada. And judges give them out, but they don't always give them out. But they need a specific warrant. CSE doesn't need a judge's warrant to do what it does, but it can't spy within Canada. And if it's going to help CSIS spy within Canada, it only does it when CSIS brings one of the judge's warrants and says, here it is, help us out. So that's the broad difference between those.
Thank you. And someone had asked, and I think you've answered the question, what is the relationship between these two organizations? So would you say that, what you just outlined is the main relationship, or is there more?
That's the main one. There are minor details. I think there is an issue, though, of how much of CSE's collection ends up getting handed back to CSIS. In areas like, for example, what's called incidental collection. CSE is not allowed to target Canadians, but a whole lot of Canadian communications get pulled in, and Canadian metadata even more so, by the kind of work that CSE does. For example, if a Canadian contacts a CSE target, or that CSE target who's outside of Canada, and that CSE target contacts a Canadian or something like that, they're perfectly within their legal authority to collect that kind of communication. So a lot of Canadian related communications, information about Canadians too, that gets collected by CSE in the course of its normal operations. How much of that gets handed back into CSIS and the RCMP is really an area that's very secret. They don't talk about it. The review agencies look at it occasionally, and they haven't highlighted anything illegal, but who knows how much is legal about what's being handed over. So I think that's an area that's always been, I think, of importance to examine in greater detail.
Thank you, Bill. The
Just-
next question.
add-
Oh,
add,
please go ahead.
I think Bill knows this better than me, but in 2011, CSE opened up a new office in Ottawa, a massive office, which my understanding is it's linked to the to CSIS, right? So the offices are right next to each other, and they have their whole links. And my understanding that's something that's new. So it sort of speaks to a even a physical connection with CSIS. I don't know how much that means in practical intelligence sharing, but the fact that they spent $1.2 billion in building a new CSE office that's linked to CSIS, I would assume is reflective of something.
Yeah, I think it's a sign. It was actually 2014 when they built it. That's no big deal. And then there was originally intention to link them physically. That was never built, but they're side beside each other in East End, Ottawa. They're right beside each other. It's evidence they do work together. They absolutely do, and that's not hidden. It's just really kind of the degree to which information about Canadians flows both ways is one thing they don't tend to talk about in any detail. That's for sure.
The next question is, I think we can start with Joshua. Can the NSA be reformed, or should it just be abolished? Is the question.
Short answer: abolished. I mean, yeah, I agree with the late great British Marxist Ralph Miliband that reform and revolution are not enemies, or generally aren't. So I wouldn't be against reform. But yeah, no, reform is always going to be a trap as long as you've got a society set up the way ours is.
Thank you. And the next question that I have is for Radhika. It's from Robert, who asks, the Anglosphere. How would anyone, how would you regard the activities of the Anglosphere within the context of white supremacy? Not sure if that question is totally clear.
Well, I mean, I think Yves quite rightly pointed out a couple of things about the Anglosphere. I mean, what does one mean? I mean, it's allegedly defined by language, but in fact it isn't. You soon find out once you scratch beneath the surface. There are also, of course, long-standing ideologies of English superiority. We think that the only people who think they have racial superiority are Germans. Well, that's not the case. I mean, the English have a tremendous sense of their superiority. In fact, well, so I think that, without going into details, that there's definitely a certain I mean, it's structurally racist. I think, sometimes I really wonder what would have happened if there would not have been a British empire, but British settler empire, which was, I mean, America soon became independent, but the British settler empire was able to keep the two world wars going, for much, if there was no America to supply them, the European warring partners would have exhausted themselves far more quickly than they in fact did. Anyway, I mean, I'm going on a bit, but yeah, I mean, sure, there's definitely, and I remember also that Britain's there is a political economy to this which is based on racism. So if you think about it, Britain by the late 19th century was losing its own industrial power, but then it became a financial and commercial power. And as a financial and commercial power, what did it do? It essentially extracted surpluses from its non-settler colonies in British India, in Africa, in the Caribbean. It literally squeezed these societies which it had already impoverished. It squeezed them further. It extracts these surpluses through a variety of means we can discuss. And what does it do with them? It invests them in its settler colonies, including the United States, namely its former settler colony. And this is what is primarily responsible for the industrialization of our countries, the United States, Canada, and to a lesser lesser extent, to the extent that they're industrialized, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So this is a straightforward racist basis. The real political economy of racism is right there. And so that's one thing. The second thing we have to remember is that countries like Canada have always occupied, we like to think that we are not an imperial nation. We may not have been directly an imperial nation, although we tried. I mean, Yves' work has shown that we have certainly tried hard. But we did that, or Canada did that, because it was always it was placed in a very comfortable niche in the international system, in the imperialist system. And it exploited this position in a variety of different ways. And we know about, and of course, Canada's own settler colonialism is implicated in this. Canada's financial imperialism is implicated in this, etc. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, the British Empire was the biggest empire compared to all the others. I mean, of course, the Belgian Empire was horrible, and so was the French and so on. But there are certain differences here as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Radhika. A very quick question for Joshua. Someone would like to know where they can find your writings.
Yeah, I saw that. Thanks. I'll let's see. I guess I'll put something in the chat. A website.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yves, a question I'm going to start with you. The CSE is officially under the Department of National Defense. Do you see it as a tool of Canadian military power around the world?
Well, Bill provided some precision on that question, in that it was under DND for multiple decades. I think once it became kind of publicly aware in 1975, I believe is the year, once it came to the public attention, then they put it under D&D, I think in part for sort of secretive purposes. And now it has sort of an odd status as being under the minister, but not technically under D&D, and Bill can probably explain that more clearly. But the CSE has made it clear that they, in a few years back, at least, maybe in like 2008 or so, I saw something on this regarding that it supports the Canadian military. And like I said, in Afghanistan, they boast on their website, they talk about how they provided vital support for the war in Afghanistan, and then in Iraq in mid-2000s. So it's clearly one element of the Canadian military has a lot of intelligence gathering apparatuses, into the thousands of people who are involved in intelligence gathering within the Canadian military. The CSE contributes to that. And I think that, but back to the kind of point I was making about the sort of legitimacy or the right or wrong of the CSE, well, that gets to the question of is the Canadian military a force of democracy around the world? Is the Canadian military a force for human rights around the world? And I would suggest that that's usually not the case, and therefore the CSE is contributing to global injustices.
Thank you. I'm only going to be able to take just a few more questions because we are really running out of time. A very quick one, which is for Joshua and Bill. Ken would like to know if you have any organizational charts or timelines of the organizations that you have been talking about in the Five Eyes network that you might be able to share at some point now, or point us to at a later date.
I don't have anything handy.
Any useful links?
I could probably
go to my blog, I guess.
All right, you heard it here. Go to Bill's blog, and I will try to we send registrants all an email out at the end, so I'll try and put a few links in as well, a few useful links in with that, with the replay. All right, so pivoting a little bit outwards. Let's talk about this. We've gotten several questions tonight, but if we could try and be brief, that would be great, about the plight of Julian Assange. and specifically Canada's role in hunting Assange using CSIS. Would any of our panelists like to comment briefly on that?
I don't know much. I just am pretty horrified that he's. It's a real threat to his life to be brought to the U.S. and it's pretty frightening that the mainstream media is dancing to the tune of the government on this.
Radhika.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to act like, I know all the nitty gritty and everything, but clearly, I mean, the fact that the Australian government, and this has been reported in some critical media, the fact that the Australian government is not taking up cudgels on behalf of its citizen who has been so maltreated. I mean, basically, his freedom has been taken away for a decade. He is suffering from psychological torture like there is no tomorrow. I mean, practically everybody who has met him has said that he's suffering from psychological torture. So the fact that the Australians are not doing anything about it, on the whole, the mainstream press is not taking up the issue. They are quietly reporting, like in the last judgment, where they said that the court said that he could be extradited. They took an extremely flimsy set of completely, as far as I know, unwritten and quite frankly, as far as the United States is concerned, I wouldn't trust anything it's written either. I mean, this country has been known to have tried to assassinate this guy. Why should you think that this, and by the way, if you had any doubts, you look at the way in which the ordinary Black people who the United States government doesn't care about, how justice goes against them repeatedly. Why do you think that they are going to be particularly scrupulous about the law when it concerns a guy they've tried to kill themselves? I mean, what kind of a logic is that? But this is your Anglo-American thinking, and this is the Anglo-American doublespeak that works. I mean, there should be, and as people have pointed out, I mean, this is not just about him. What is happening to him is also in a certain sense happening to us, in the sense that we are allowing our freedoms to be slowly drained away, and this is horrible. So yeah, I mean, and he is among the heroes of our age, and look at what's happened to him. This is the price he's paying for being one of the heroes of our age. But anyway.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, I'd like to hear if Bill maybe had any evidence of the CSE. I doubt it's in the public record, but of the CSE contributing in any way to trying to get intel on Julian Assange. But what I can say at the Trudeau government level is they had a conference, a big media democracy conference in London 2 years ago, I believe. It was a Canada-British joint media democracy conference. And a number of people pointed out that the conference took place like 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers away from the prison where Julian was being held. And Melanie Joly posted yesterday, or maybe it's 2 or 3 days ago, Canada's new foreign minister posted another follow-up to that media democracy. And I should say nothing was mentioned about Julian Assange at that media democracy conference. And it was a big, how we are struggling for media democracy around the world. And again, Melanie Joly posted about another, I think there was a Zoom follow-up on that media democracy initiative. And again, nothing about him is mentioned. So the Canadian government has, at minimum, has not, expressed support for his freedom. And my hunch would be that the CSE, possibly CSIS, but more likely the CSE had, helped in one way or another in getting intel on him.
I just like to add as well that the coincidences of the sort that Yves is talking about reminded me that this so-called farcical summit of the democracies that was held by Biden, it was held on the day that democracy died in a British court with the, I mean, what are you talking about? You are democracies, etc. I mean, this is ludicrous. I mean, liberal democracies are essentially setups created to essentially somehow balance one person, one vote, which they had to concede, with preserving the rule of a tiny elite. I mean, that's the system we have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, speakers. So the last question, I'm going to group two of them together that I'm going to end with, just because of the extreme geopolitical importance is around China. So the two last questions that I have here are, first, what's the argument for banning Huawei, and should we? And then, where do we see things going in the conflict with China?
I guess I'll take up there is really no argument for banning Huawei, and I'll just say one or two things. First of all, the reason why Western countries want to ban Huawei is not that it's going to give all the secrets to the Chinese government, because even if the Chinese government found out, what you bought for Christmas or whatever, what's it going to do with that? That's one set of ideas. But the second thing is, the reason why Western governments don't want Huawei to have any access to telecommunications in Western countries is because they will not get from Huawei the sort of cooperation that the other companies, the Facebooks and the Amazons, etc., have been giving regularly to Western governments. This is what's going to disappear. That's why they don't want Huawei. And of course, for the rest, they don't want Huawei because they represent technological competition to Western corporations, and they feel that they are losing out, and somehow they are trying to come up with some sort of industrial policy for that. And one final point. What's really remarkable is that these corporations that are constantly taking our data and abusing it in ways that they have promised in writing not to do, is because we have a capitalism in crisis. If you can't find a market by essentially making your goods attractive, then you want to find ways of manipulating people so that they will buy your goods. And this is what we are supporting. I mean, it's stupid, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, the argument for banning Huawei is that it would, create some sort of backdoor that could be used to spy. Back in 2014, The Verge, in a story called "The NSA has reportedly been spying on Huawei's servers for years," it explained, quote, "Somewhat ironically, however, the US government appears to be doing something very similar to what it accuses Huawei of. The New York Times is reporting that the NSA has created its own backdoors directly into Huawei's telecommunication networks for the purpose of collecting information on the vast array of hardware that the company claims connects a third of the global population." So there is, a lot of evidence that the NSA has been pushing telecommunications companies for backdoors, and the presumption is that Huawei would be a little bit less receptive of doing that on behalf of the NSA. And or the CSE and other elements of the Five Eyes. I think that Huawei is maybe it's the first and the biggest of the global high-tech companies from China, and it's the crown jewel of China Inc. And so weakening Huawei, which they have been very successful at, we have to be really clear that the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal have reported that Huawei has done very badly in recent years, in part because of the American boycott and the other countries that have blocked its involvement in 5G. So it's the obviously the arrest of Meng Wanzhou was tied to that campaign. So it has been successful. Now, what is the campaign against China? Why is the US focusing on China? That's, I think, a big, somewhat complicated question. Obviously, the military-industrial complex likes having conflict that justifies increased military spending. Same thing with the security agencies in Canada. They like to hype up threats, and that justifies military spending, intelligence spending. I do think there is a really genuine geostrategic conflict taking place where China is not willing to just follow Washington's orders in the way that many European countries are willing to do, and that is of course a threat to U.S. Global hegemony. China is a rapidly, I call it industrializing, or it's moving up the chain of technology, but it's still a fairly poor country. If you look at like GDP, so I think it's something around like $10,000 per person, which is, I think the US GDP is like 50,000 per person. But it is the most populous nation. It, by such, rightfully should be the most powerful nation in the world, as much as that may trouble people some people in the so-called Anglosphere, but it is the most populous nation. But I think that, yeah, the U.S. is threatened by China's not following the rules, and that's been the case, for a long time, right? The war in Korea in the early 1950s was partly a war on China after the nationalist communist victory in '49. But in the past couple of decades, China has done quite well economically, and it's getting to a closer position of being sort of a challenge economically to U.S., not militarily. The U.S. is far and away militarily the supreme power, with military bases all around China, and heavily control of the seaways around China. But I think there is there's a real geopolitical battle, but there's also just simple arms companies want to justify more military spending.
Thank you, Yves. Any final comments from any of the other speakers before we end our discussion for the evening?
Well, okay, this is silly, but since Radhika had such a great title for her talk, I'm jealous and I wanted to remember mine. Mine was, where is it? Here it is. 5 Eyes or Cyclops, Power, Knowledge, and Empire. So anyway.
I love it.
Really,
Cyclops.
really
That's
great.
brilliant.
I really appreciate learning from everybody. It's been really fun.
Same here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh my goodness, what an incredible evening. I've actually learned so much tonight. And I can't thank our panelists enough for sharing so generously with us all of their expertise, all of this knowledge. Our audience, you are now in the know, as Bill said, about some subjects that very few people have a window into. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's a tough event, but an important one, because it is a hard nut to crack, this topic, due to the secretive nature. But I am happy that tonight we were able to shed some light on these organizations and the relationships between them. And regarding, the CSC, 5 Eyes, and Canada's role, we think that these are subjects that require a lot more attention. And so we hope to revisit this soon at the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. So I would encourage you to stay tuned for more events like these. And again, if you do like events like these, please do consider donating to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute at foreignpolicy.ca/donate. It's been a tremendous event. Thank you so much. Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, Yves. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Joshua. Have a wonderful night. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
For our event today.
Bye-bye.
Bye.